All right. So our last session before lunch is not really a session. I am delighted to introduce you to the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, John Koskinen. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing him, other than to tell you that when our annual report came out in 2014 recommending that the IRS adopt the Taxpayer Bill of Rights as opposed to waiting for Congress to pass it, basically what he said to me was, that's a good idea. And then June 10th, the IRS adopted the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. In December, after I wrote my prospectus about this conference, I went to him and said, I would like to do this. And his response was, that's a good idea. And then I was really worked on, I was trying to think about how to say this to him without it sounding really obnoxious, and I couldn't find another way to say it, and I just said, you do realize that this is going to be my conference? And he said, yeah, that's a good idea. So to show his support for this, which has been constant, he's here, and I will just let you hear from him directly. So welcome the Commissioner.
Thanks, Nina. We'll find out whether my appearance here is a good idea when we get done with it all. But I am delighted to be here today with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to join you in this first international conference on taxpayer rights. All of us are still obviously in shock at the tragic events that occurred last week in Paris, and our thoughts and prayers are with the people of France in this time of great sorrow for them. I'm especially encouraged that so many of you from so far away are here in our nation's capital to talk with us on this subject. You're visiting Washington at a wonderful time. I must say, it's normally not this beautiful at this time of the year. It's usually colder, but you've obviously brought good weather, at least for today, and I hope you'll be able to take advantage of everything the city has to offer. I'd also like to reciprocally recognize Nina, because my hat's off to her for organizing this conference really totally on her own, and for spanning the globe to recruit such an impressive and diverse group from so many different countries and revenue agencies, both to participate on the panels, but also to participate in the conference with us. And we're delighted to have all of you here. I've been thinking more and more about the international aspects of taxation, since I'll be traveling in a couple weeks to a meeting of the Bureau of the Forum on Tax Administration that will take place in Paris. The forum, operating under the aegis of the OECD, is comprised of the tax commissioners from 46 large countries. A couple of them are joining parts of this conference, in fact. The Bureau, comprised of tax commissioners from 13 of those countries, oversees forum activities between the general meetings. So at this meeting of the Bureau, I'll be reporting to them about this conference and the shared perspectives on the importance of taxpayer rights. In recent years, we've seen reforms in the public sector really across the world, and notably, establishing rights and remedies for taxpayers has been a part of these reforms. By now, just about every revenue agency has some version of taxpayer rights by statute or decree. No matter the approach, the bottom line is that more and more countries are focused on this issue, and we're delighted to play a small role in sharing and allowing everyone to share their experiences and their perspectives on the roles of taxpayer rights in tax administration. So it brings me to the subject at hand of how we in the United States have approached the issue of taxpayer rights. Historically, this has been a unifying issue for our lawmakers. In fact, taxpayer rights has been one of those rare issues to attract bipartisan support in the recent past. And as you've been discussing, we now have a variety of laws in the United States describing what taxpayers have the right to expect when they deal with the Internal Revenue Service. So I'd like to focus on what we did as an agency, because last year, as Nina noted, we took an important additional step. We adopted a Taxpayer Bill of Rights modeled after the Bill of Rights in our Constitution. And I'm happy to report that it's been a tremendously positive development thus far. We have 85,000 employees in more than 500 offices around the country. And when I first became commissioner, I emphasized my belief that if you really want to learn what's going on in an organization, if you really want to know more about the challenges and the opportunities, it's important to talk to and listen to frontline employees. Actually, I initially said when I joined that I would like to see all of the offices, and I was advised there were more than 500 of them, at which point I said I'd like to see some of the offices. So I spent a great deal of time traveling around the country to various offices and meeting and talking with employees. And I was pleasantly surprised to learn that a major focus of the agency and our employees is helping taxpayers, and by extension, protecting their rights. I was delighted to learn how much time and effort we spend helping taxpayers. And apparently I'm not the only one. An interesting aspect of being commissioner is you get letters from taxpayers of all kinds. Some have legitimate complaints and concerns, and we work to resolve those. But many letters are sent because taxpayers feel compelled to compliment an employee who had worked with them and helped resolve a tax issue. One letter I received was from a woman whose elderly parents had become victims of identity theft, a challenging problem we have in the United States that fortunately many other countries have not been subject to. But in her letter, she explained how her parents were struggling, and after their identities were stolen and the criminals filed fraudulent tax returns in her parents' names, they were overwhelmed, confused, and facing stiff tax penalties. These taxpayers, like all taxpayers, had the right to pay no more than what they owe. They had the right to be informed. They had the right to quality service. And with the persistence and expertise of one of our many outstanding employees at the IRS, the family was able to fully resolve their issues. So every time a taxpayer writes me to commend an employee for doing good work, we thank the taxpayer for writing. We tell them that every person has a right to the kind of service they got from that particular employee. We also write a letter to the employee, thanking them for a job well done and reinforcing our appreciation for their level of dedication and expertise. These small victories are crucial, especially in a difficult operating environment. It's the small victories that build momentum and morale among employees. And ultimately, it helps reinforce the taxpayer rights that support everything we do as tax administrators. Another way to look at it is when we respect taxpayer rights, it pays dividends in terms of increased public confidence. Despite hearing many positive stories and small victories from the front lines, last year I came to believe that we, as an institution, needed to do more to explain these rights to the public. Nina had been encouraging the agency actually for some time to do just that. And so she and I agreed, as she noted. I said, well, that's a good idea. We needed to do more to show taxpayers how deeply we respect their rights. Much of what we have done has relevance for taxpayers and tax administrators around the world. As I've met with tax administrators from a wide range of countries, we've agreed that we're all in many ways in the same business of helping taxpayers determine what they owe and how to pay it. But as you're discussing at this conference, there are many differences from countries to country that may determine your approach, and what's right for us may not be totally right for you in all of the details. But we generally work to achieve compliance with tax obligations in two ways, through service to taxpayers and enforcement. I tend to think of service and enforcement as two sides of the same compliance coin. Most people want to comply, but they need the agency to provide services that make compliance possible. At the same time, if people think they're not going to get caught if they cheat or they're just fed up because they can't get the help they need to file their taxes, the entire compliance system will be put at risk. Notably, the amount of money we collect through our enforcement activities, while it's a significant amount standing on its own, is a small part of the overall funds we collect through providing services that allow people to voluntarily comply, and that's why taxpayer service is so critical. In the United States, for example, our collection efforts yield about $50 to $60 billion a year, but the overall compliance of our taxpayers yields about $3.1 trillion a year. So a big part of voluntary compliance comes down to service. It comes down to fairness. We know from many years of research that one of the biggest drivers of compliance is the feeling that your neighbors are paying their taxes too. In talking to my friends in the United Kingdom, for example, that's what they discovered through surveys of their taxpayers. When you know everyone else is paying their share, you're willing to pay as well. Thus, my view is that the passage in the United States of the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act was important not just for the revenue, additionally, that we're now collecting. It also sends an important signal to the average American taxpayer that even the very rich, with fancy accountants and tax attorneys, are no longer able to hide their money abroad and avoid paying their fair share of taxes. It's helpful to discuss fairness in terms of the overall system, but perhaps more important, we're also focusing on taxpayer rights in the context of one-to-one relationships with individual taxpayers. Historically in the United States, looking back over the last 3 decades, we've had taxpayer rights embedded in a wide range of statutes. This is also something you've discussed and will continue to discuss, because what happened with us was it wasn't very easy for taxpayers to find, much less understand, all of those rights spread throughout a range of statutes. There just wasn't a place to see them all in one place and begin to understand them. And so to her credit, as I noted, Nina had been encouraging the IRS for some time to pull all of the taxpayer rights together so they'd be easily available and easily defined for taxpayers across the country. And so, working with Nina, we did just that. And in June of 2014, we announced to the public that through administrative action, we had adopted a Taxpayers Bill of Rights. In other words, people finally had an easy, plain language explanation of laws that had been in effect for several years. Before our announcement, public awareness of the rights of taxpayers was relatively low. Nina's office did a lot of research in prior years, and she came to some interesting conclusions based on focus groups they did around the country. Most people didn't know they had the right to retain representation. They didn't know they had the right to challenge the IRS's position and to be heard. They didn't know they had the right to pay no more than they actually owed. And perhaps it's no surprise these days, in light of our budget constraints, they were most skeptical about the fact that they had a right to quality service. Our main goal in establishing the Taxpayer Bill of Rights was we wanted to raise public awareness of their rights. We wanted to explain several things to the public and their representatives about their rights. It was important to make clear that our actions were not creating new rights, that this was a continuation rather than a first-time effort of respecting taxpayers' rights. In other words, it wasn't that we didn't respect the rights of taxpayers until we issued the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. We simply wanted to draw more attention to the issue on the behalf of taxpayers. One of the most visible changes we made was updating a helpful guide that we include with notices and letters mailed to taxpayers. We call it Publication 1, and it's entitled Your Rights as a Taxpayer. And it now lists the 10 broad categories of rights that we announced last year. The publication was first created nearly 30 years ago, after passage of the first set of U.S. laws establishing taxpayer rights. Today, we print and send about 30 million copies a year. We also translate the publication into several languages, including Spanish, Chinese, Korean, Russian, and Vietnamese. The end result is that the Taxpayer Bill of Rights now becomes a more visible part of the way our system operates. When you receive a letter from the IRS, you get the helpful reminder that it's clear that you have these 10 basic rights. Each one is important to know and important to understand. In addition to updating Publication 1, we took other steps to raise awareness. We put signs and posters on display in IRS offices around the country. We released a new video on our YouTube channel. See how current we are? We're on YouTube. I tell people I do not know how to Twitter or Tumble, so we do that, but I don't know how. We created a special section also on our website, irs.gov. I should also note that promoting taxpayer rights to the public has only been one part of the equation. Equally important has been our efforts to remind employees about what this means for them in their day-to-day work. As we explained to the employees, it wasn't that taxpayers didn't have these rights before, and it certainly wasn't that our employees weren't honoring these rights. Instead, it's about making a concerted effort to ensure that taxpayers know their rights and feel comfortable asserting them, which is easier to do when the rights are visible wherever they show up. I personally sent a message to every employee explaining why we took this action. We conducted surveys throughout the year to assess how well employees understood the issue. We also provided managers with helpful information and encouraged them to have meaningful discussions with their employees about the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. We also started the process of updating our internal procedures so that when a revenue agent, for example, relies on written procedures, there's a clear reminder about why the basic taxpayer rights are important and how they work. As I noted, you'll discuss today and tomorrow the fact that we are, as tax administrators and revenue agencies, in many ways in the same business, with key differences. So taxpayer rights in one country may not look the same as taxpayer rights in another. And there are plenty of good reasons to explain why, and we see our Taxpayer Bill of Rights as just one example and illustration about how you could proceed in this area. Nonetheless, within the framework of a system that's viewed as fair, we all have the same interests. They just get articulated in different ways depending on any number of factors. There are different systems, different structures, different tax codes, and on it goes. But no matter what the context, it will always be true that fairness leads to positive outcomes. The voluntary compliance rate will be at an appropriately high level when taxpayer rights are observed and supported. The system will function more effectively, and the revenue that funds government operations will be collected consistently. Finally, let me just say that another very important issue is obviously securing appropriate funding for the revenue agency. How can you uphold taxpayer rights, especially the right to quality service, without the funding to support your operations? In the United States, we are generating, because of a relatively low level of taxpayer service, which we regret, more voices of support on this issue, and the voices are growing louder every day. And we have high hopes that this year, for the first time in 6 years, we might actually get an increase in funding rather than a decrease, which has been our situation for the last 5 years. Last week, several former commissioners of the IRS, in fact, stated their support in a letter to Congress. And again this week, another letter of support was sent to Congress, this time by the National Society of Accountants, a major group of tax and accounting professionals. This morning, the IRS Advisory Council, an established council of people from the private sector who work with us year in and year out looking at very specific issues of tax administration, also joined in raising their concerns about the level of IRS funding. So as an agency, we're speaking up and making our position clear, and in fact, our position is relatively straightforward. It's common sense. Taxpayers have the right to expect a certain level of service, and we need the funding to meet that demand. We need the funding to operate in a way that protects taxpayer rights, primarily because the tax code, certainly the U.S. tax code, creates many complicated situations for the taxpayer. But when we operate with an underlying commitment to respect those 10 basic rights, it's good for taxpayers, it's good for the Internal Revenue Service, and it's good for the global tax system, especially as the world takes a more coordinated approach to tax collection. So I thank you for your time and attention and for joining us in the discussions you're having about the Taxpayer Bill of Rights and taxpayer rights generally. And I hope you find the discussions helpful in your own approach to developing and ensuring the rights of taxpayers wherever they may be. Thanks very much. Shall I take a question? Now, there's always a great risk of being the last person between an audience and lunch or food of any kind. But I have a couple minutes if anybody has questions of any kind. I would be happy to try to answer them. That looks like a suspiciously familiar face.
William Hoffman, Tax Notes Today, Mr. Commissioner. One of the speakers on the last panel mentioned something that occurred back in the 1980s and early 90s, I believe, called the Eagle Lodge, which was a secret conclave of tax officials and very exclusive tax executives who met annually without any press present, but apparently with a large number of IRS and Treasury officials. I'm wondering if any kind of those conclaves in any manner, way, or form exists today.
We all chuckle, but it's an important question because I think one of the fundamental principles we have and that I strongly support is the importance of transparency. That in fact, whatever we do should be visible to the public. They should understand why we're taking the actions we're taking, and that we should not be making decisions in small groups or in some back office somewhere. And in fact, I feel very strongly about that for operations within the agency. My view about how the agency should function, as I say, we have about 85,000 people. There's a natural tendency for large organizations to be command and control structures, where in fact you give orders and instructions to people, you provide them guidance, and then they do the work. And the information flows from the top down only. And I have a strong view that the most successful organizations function with information flowing equally effectively from the bottom up. In a large organization, The only way to know what's going on, as I said, is to listen to what people actually doing the work on the front lines have to say. So that whenever we do anything, we're in the middle of, we have been for some time, budget constraints. The last fiscal year, which just ended in September 30th, we had to basically institute a total hiring freeze, except for emergencies. The way we got through that year with a significant funding cut delivered to us last December was for the entire senior executive team of the organization, 30 to 35 executives, to sit around a table for 3 or 4 days going through the options of where it is we could find additional savings or efficiencies, but where were the initiatives that we had to fund if we were going to keep going forward. And so across the board, and I think Bill's question is an important one, my view is if you are, for us anyway, if you're the revenue agency, if you're collecting taxes, if you have the power that we have, then people have to be comfortable they know how you're exercising that power, how you're actually implementing the tax code. So the short answer, that was a long peroration, the short answer is we do not have any of those secret meetings. And in fact, I had this meeting this morning with what's called the IRS Advisory Council, or IRSAC, and when they make their reports to us, it's a public meeting. And in fact, one of Bill's colleagues was there this morning. And so I do think it's important for public confidence, for the public to understand what you're doing, why you're doing, and how you're doing it. I mentioned our procedures that we have for employees. When those are finalized, they're available to the public. You can see exactly what the instructions are to revenue agents, revenue officers. And I'm comfortable with that. I think more than comfortable with it. I think it's critical to the way you operate.
So I've been a tax practitioner in Paris, France for the last 4 years. I know you're aware of the fact that the 8.5 million American expatriates are feeling somewhat disenfranchised from the IRS by virtue of closing the 3 remaining foreign posts. It's sending a real bad message to the Americans overseas. Is there any possibility you could consider allowing NINA's, as a national taxpayer advocate, to have offices overseas in these various posts? And even better than just the last 3 that are being closed. It's a real problem, sir, I tell you that.
No, I understand that. In fact, Nina and I work very closely together, and another one of my philosophies when I spent 20 years in the private sector and I've spent about 20, 25 years in the public sector is I'm a great supporter of inspectors general, internal auditors, the general accounting office, because you need, just as with employees, you need to get feedback about what's actually happening. And Nina performs a critical role for us, continuing to focus on the rights of taxpayers, the concerns of taxpayers, individual cases of taxpayers. And so she and I have had a lot of conversations about how we deal with the constrained budget that we have, but at the same time, how we deal with trying to move the agency forward. And as Nina says, and I keep reminding our employees, we're not like a financial institution that can say, well, here's a group of people that don't produce much revenue, so we won't worry about them. We'll focus on our core business. Ultimately, our core business is going to be a vast majority of people that are going to deal with us digitally in the digital economy, and that's one of the things we're trying to accomplish. But there'll always be, well, there's only 2 or 3% of the population that either don't have access to the digital economy, digital communication, or aren't comfortable with it. And even though it's only 2 or 3%, in our case, that's 3 to 4 or 5 million people. And we need to make sure that we don't leave them behind. And similarly, I take the point, and we are concerned about it, we ought not to leave behind Americans who are living and working abroad. And so part of our problem in terms of looking at those final offices has been that we've, in effect, closed a number of foreign offices where we had people. And it's been an attempt on our part both to deal efficiently with our funding restraints, but also to try to make sure that we provide alternatives. So in both locally and internationally, we need to make it easy and comfortable for taxpayers to reach us. And so one of the things we're now working on very hard is to figure out, can we, especially for people abroad, create a more efficient way for them to communicate directly with us, not necessarily by the phone. We've talked, Nina, we've talked about different ways that we might be able to deal with that. But it's not as if we don't understand that problem. And I think it is something that we need to be cognizant of and try to figure out how we can get better communication from people abroad, how we can answer their questions. Again, we were discussing at my meeting earlier this morning, an element of taxpayer service is the right to service, the right to the ability to get your questions answered. These are usually people who are trying to comply, but they have a question or they don't know exactly how to proceed. And those are, by definition, the people you ought to be able to reach out to. And so We haven't done this without thinking about it, and Nina and I will continue, as you can tell by her smile, to have this conversation because it's part of a larger issue for us, and that is how do, as we move forward, do we make sure we don't leave people behind? They need to be able to reach us easily.
That's a good idea.
That's very good. Very good. See, it's a very fast-learning group here, I can see. One last question over here, and then I've got another meeting, and you've got lunch.
Okay, thank you very much, Commissioner, for being here. We really appreciate it. My name is Marty Davidoff. I'm a practitioner in Central New Jersey, and I wanted to compliment your stakeholder liaison group who constantly meets with us virtually and in many ways to get information and feed it back to the owners of various programs in the IRS. Unfortunately, and I wanted to get your comments or at least get your acknowledgement of this, unfortunately, when we go to our taxpayer, our stakeholder liaison and ask them a question, they say, the owner's response is blank. And I say, can we speak to the owner? And they say, no, we can't speak to the owner of that program because we're not allowed to. So I would encourage you to allow us not just to go through your stakeholder liaison, but if there's a program, whether it's the offer and compromise program, whether it's installment agreements, whether it's some sort of administrative thing, we're trying to work together with you as practitioners. Let us have access to the owner. Better yet, all those working groups looking at the future, get some practitioners, not just on IRSAC where they're going to work on a top level, but get some of us practitioners down in those working committees where I've asked at meetings, I said, how many practitioners are on your working committee dealing with that, Ms. Schiller, or how many people are working on that? Get practitioners like myself and many here who would say, we'll volunteer to be on those committees and we'll work with you to brainstorm to get solutions. So those are my comments, and if you have any comments about that, I'd love to hear.
Those are great comments. Actually, at the meeting, the IRSAC meeting this morning, 6 to 8 of those people are practitioners. And in fact, all of our established working groups with the private sector focus on practitioners for just the reason you note. And that is you're the ones doing the work with taxpayers. You're the ones who are able to give us prompt feedback about what's happening not only with particular elements domestically but internationally. And so we do have, and I appreciate the offer of volunteers. In fact, everybody who serves on these committees are volunteers. We just recognized 8 of them this morning who have been on for their terms and are rotating off. But I think the point you raise is critical. And in fact, as I talk to them, as all tax administrators, we have actually statutory mandates that we protect taxpayer information, that we do whatever we can and that we don't share it. And the natural tendency, because of also the influence we have and the power we have, is for us to be reclusive to some extent. It goes to Bill's point about transparency. So one of the reasons we prize these ongoing existing committees that rotate people through is because they give us an opportunity to hear from people in the private sector and people who are actually working with taxpayers. I meet regularly with the accounting. I'm meeting this afternoon with the heads of the National Society of Accountants, and I meet regularly with the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, which is 300,000 members, and we need to do that. I guess my last thing I will note, and again, it might be useful for tax administrators, in dealing with identity theft, I brought last March together, invited the CEOs of tax software developers, tax preparers, payroll providers, and the state tax administrators. And I told them the reason for the gathering was not for me or the IRS to tell them what to do. The reason for the gathering was for all of us to create a partnership to actually deal together with the issue of identity theft and refund fraud. Because as I told them, when it's axiomatic, none of us can by ourselves deal with that problem alone. That we are much more effective. We're increasingly dealing with organized crime syndicates around the world, and we'll be much more effective doing that if we in fact harness all of the energy, all of the resources, all of the insights of the private sector, the states, and the IRS. So I think your point's well taken, and we need to continue to reach out to people in the private sector who have experience to get the best advice they have, but most importantly, just to understand what's happening out there. What does it look like from the standpoint of people who are preparers, who are taxpayers? Are there ways we can make compliance easier and make it more understandable? Well, again, I thank all of you for coming. As I always... And enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to joining you tonight at the reception. Have a good day.
All right. So just as you're leaving, Translation equipment, turn them in outside the theater. You can pick them up, or if you're staying in the same seat, you can leave them in that seat, and but don't take them outside for lunch. There's a restaurant list in your folder, and food's only allowed in the foyer where we have our breaks. You can't take it upstairs. That's all I need to say. We'll see you back in an hour. Thank you.